don't know whether to say good evening or good afternoon. It's kind of in between. Good sundown to you all. I'm Ann Headland. I'm a local Silver Cityan. Since 2012, I've lived here permanently. I am a cultural anthropologist who works with living artists. And I spent just under 30 years in the Arizona university system. It's always nice to be back on a campus, what have you. I spent a dozen years at ASU first and then moved to the University of Arizona. So I moved here from Tucson. I want to thank Barbara Flores and Faye McCalmont and their teams for putting this on. I was delighted to be asked to share this new book and tell you a few stories and show you a bunch of pictures. My real purpose tonight is twofold. One is to celebrate and to share these images and their stories, and the other is to break a number of stereotypes and to continue breaking those stereotypes that the postcards have ingrained in many of us. So there are two aims here tonight. Picture postcards have been around since the late 1860s, since just after the Civil War and the birth of photography as well. I love them because they, first of all, represent a pictorial history, a pictorial record of events and places. They commemorate both local and very famous events, both. They provide a record of where families live and where they travel to. They remind us of what life is like in far-flung places. When we send postcards through the mail, they connect us, they communicate, whether in a simple greeting or an elaborate report of personal travels, or sometimes I've found that messages on postcards don't even link with the picture on the postcard, as we shall see. In the American Southwest, they have in many ways created the aura of our Southwest. Postcards were a tool to promote tourism. They were a tool to promote Indian arts and crafts as well. Fred Harvey Company, you're going to be seeing many cards produced by the Fred Harvey Company, sold through national parks all over the country, not just the Southwest. The Santa Fe Railroad and Fred Harvey Company were in cahoots, and we'll see a lot of this. I hadn't actually thought a lot about postcards until about exactly 1 year and 3 months ago. And so I will tell you a true story next. 1 year and 3 months ago, I was back at the Arizona State Museum on the University of Arizona campus looking at some of the textiles in our collections there. And I was working with some colleagues, conservators, and graduate students, and puzzling over particular technical traits. And I won't trouble you with the specific technical traits, but we were talking about the ups and downs of these pieces, the size of them relative to many looms, and we were talking about the fronts and the backs and how a weaver faced the work and what was going on the other side. I said two things during those sessions. And I have to tell you, these are composite sessions from many other museums as well. I just put them together so that you get a sense of what one half of my life is in museum collections. The other half is with living artists. I said, first of all, I have no deadlines ahead. Second, I said, you know, over these last 30, 40 years, I've never given myself the pleasure of looking at enough historic photographs and really living within those photographs to answer, and I think if I had, we could answer some of the questions that we'd had that day. So that happened, and 1 week later, out of the blue and entirely unrelated to that conversation or these research sessions, I got a phone call from a man in Carmel I'd never heard of. Peter Hiller said, I'm an art teacher. I have spent the last 20 years collecting historic photographs and postcards of Navajo weavers at work. Would you like to play with me? And how? So this is what he sent me. He had over 200, mostly postcards as you see, but some artwork as they're propped up, and some photographs as well. And would I like to play with him? So Peter was in Carmel. We enlisted a third person, Ramona Sakiestewa, who is a Hopi weaver and artist, fabulous graphic designer and consultant for museums across the world, not just the country. Ramona and Peter had known each other, and it was in fact Ramona who put him up to calling me, and we put her up to becoming a partner in this deal. So 1 year later, we produced this little book. I liked to call it at first my little gray book, because it was a lot of black and white photos, but when Peter sent me all the collection, you could see how much color was in there as well. So now they form the focus. I had to learn a little bit about postcards themselves, and I won't belabor this too much, but I found it fascinating. Some of the postcards he'd collected were not sent, and we had to look at the ways in which they were designed and the lettering and the labels to date these postcards. That was a fascinating endeavor for me. The earliest postcards, as I'd said earlier, date to 1860, but they really became popular during the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. The undivided backs we know date from 1901 to 1907. Early dated backs date 1907 to 1914. And then later cards added legends and zip codes and you can see barcodes and all of that kind of thing. Now some of the cards do have information on them, and postmarks were really important for that reason. But then, you know, I was hopeful the messages would be interesting too. And instead we find, "Dear Bobby, this sure is a real Western place. Love, Mother and Dad." There were a few, a little more revealing down on the right, just left the point, had to go into Indian Village and see wonderful rugs. We didn't learn a lot from the messages, but as you can guess, we learned a lot from the images on the other side. Now, there's a very important issue to address in dealing with this subject, and I've dealt with this almost all of my career in anthropology and working particularly with living artists, and that is that Native American people, many different members of many different tribes, object to their photographs being taken. It is a fact that many Native people consider it soul stealing and a controlling factor that they had no, they were never asked permission and they were not responsible for those photographs. And a photo like this is really unusual where two people are actually confronting the camera. We cannot know, this photo is titled in the Arizona Historical Collection, "Two Navajos in 1890. But we don't know who the photographer is, we don't know the situation. Did they receive compensation for this? What is going on here? And there are mysteries in even the published postcards that I'm dealing with like this. I will tell you that many of these images are now prized by Navajo people. And one of my aims has been to publish these things in order to bring them back home. And I'll say a few words about that in just a few minutes. So it does leave me perplexed, it leaves me apologetic at times, and it also leaves me remembering the many, many hours I've spent at kitchen tables in Navajo families' homes going through their own photo albums, page after page after page. And the fact that these are records for families as well, to me makes a difference. So I just visited the Navajo Nation. I just came back yesterday from Window Rock and Ganado, and this was my first outing to share the book with Navajo families. And it was Keshmish Festival in Window Rock. Keshmish is Christmas in Navajo, an anglicization. And Hubble Trading Post is already stocking the book. I was sharing with people, here I'm alone. I wish I could have taken my camera and shot from my side of the table out, because what happened, I'm sitting in the Navajo Nation Museum and Library here, and mostly there were 70 or so arts and crafts vendors, and I was the only bookseller. But people would come up, start paging through the book, and start telling me more stories. Oh, I remember helping my grandma do this. They'd pull in their kids, they'd say, see, this is what your mom did. See, this is how it goes. Look at the sheep in the field there. So the book is on its way to doing what its job is, as far as I'm concerned. I'm really pleased with that. It's the people in the postcards that we think of, I think of often. They are rarely identified by name. Elle of Ganado was one of, as they frequently say on the postcards, one of the most famous Navajo weavers of the tribe. Her Navajo name is Astzantlichi, which means red woman in Navajo, in Diné language. She was from Ganado. She and her husband traveled to Albuquerque and practically lived in the Alvarado Hotel for years at a time. They also went to the Panama Expositions, Panama California Exposition and California Pacific Expositions in 1915 and 1916 in San Diego and in San Francisco. They were very accustomed to communicating what they did and who they were to the public. And this was, again, a Fred Harvey and Santa Fe Railroad enterprise. So we see Elle, and you're going to revisit her many times. She wove 2 rugs for presidents of the United States, for Teddy Roosevelt and for Taft as well. Another person identified in many photographs almost 50 years later is Mrs. Happy Claw. Mrs. Claw and her husband lived in Monument Valley, and they had I don't know if you call it a concession, but they fixed their home site up to be a host for photographers. And they made as much from photography on site as they did from weaving and other crafts, I believe. They later also hosted filmmakers, and their family is the subject of 2 movies. I talk about that in the book. They're quite an interesting family. You can see here on the left, Mrs. Claw's hair is quite black, and here she, decades later, is still posing for the camera, and here again, still after she was widowed as well. When I first started telling people I was working on this book, I was working on a postcard book of Navajo weaving, they assumed it was about rugs themselves, and they assumed, many people that I talked to just thought right away, oh, it's going to be a picture book of rugs. Well, you've already seen not quite so, but there is a chapter in the book that focuses on what do we see on the loom and how much variety is there, ranging from classic 19th century models for reproduction. As you see on the left, that's a Moki stripe blanket, which means the dark background is actually alternating black and blue stripes, to regional rug styles that were prominent in the mid-20th century, the Ganado or Clagato rug there. And then I was pleased that a number of the postcards we put in the book have pictorial images as well. So there is something to say about what's on the loom. But I am so much more focused because what the weavers have always talked about to me is the process, not the product. The designs change. The designs change from the moment Navajo weavers learned to weave 4 centuries ago. The shifting of designs is anchored by the loom that you're going to see repeatedly in these photographs, the tools, the time it takes, and the connections that the weavers make with the land and with their flocks of sheep. Now, many of the photographs were black and white originally, historically, and early on, those photographs, a print of that photograph was taken and hand-colored and then reproduced as a postcard. This is Elle of Ganado again. This is the photographer J.R. Willis shot her in 1915 in San Diego. And you see on the left, beautiful rug, pretty wild green color. If you look closely, it is exactly the same rug that shows up as a red rug or as a gray and black rug. So we learned very early on in working with these postcards that you can't trust the story they tell always, and this is going to be a theme for the rest of the evening. So wonderful postcards. This is again Elle. She is seated in the center back carding with her husband Tom on the right. This is a painting from a black and white photograph at the Alvarado Hotel, the Fred Harvey Hotel in Albuquerque. It was taken from this black and white photograph, but notice what happened to the rug in the process. Apparently the painter wasn't quite up to the skills that the weaver had. So, and you do notice that the backdrop is entirely painted in. Postcards tell us a lot about places and a lot about where weavers worked. but they also suggest that certain settings shifted. So for instance, this weaver, fabulous photograph from the 1890s, working on a very large loom. Behind and to the right is not a pile of wood. That is a hogan of very rough mud and log construction. And that hogan probably wouldn't accommodate a loom of her size. But more than likely, she would have built a shade or a structure over this loom, as you'll see in a minute. We suspect that, number one, photographers traveled in good weather, right? So they came out in the summers. They didn't photograph in the winters. We suspect that photographs were often taken in natural light. They couldn't have been taken inside the hogan. And that photographers asked the weavers to move their looms either outside or away from the summer shade. So a picture like this has some verisimilitude, but not absolutely accurate. We can't count on it. I do know weavers that weave outdoors in the summer, but they're almost always sheltered with a log chalath like this to protect them. And some photographs like this one. Esther Henderson was a wonderful journalist in Tucson, and again, a hand-colored image. She documented very nicely this setting. There are absolutely pristine settings. I'm sure most of you know about Edward Curtis's photography and his beautiful books, the huge volumes of photographs that he created. And here we have a very atmospheric, very much an art photograph of a weaver undisturbed by anything. In contrast, the real life, the real story. A cook pot bubbling on the wood fire, kids playing, grandma taking care of a child. You can see a buckboard here. Here is a shade and protection for this loom. And if there were thunderstorms or summer storms coming in, she would cover that up. There were probably tools and implements tucked into the roof and into the shade behind and behind this wall as well. There may have been fruit drying on top of the roof. Lots going on compared to that Edward Curtis image. Weaving took place in lots of different places in the early 20th century, and throughout, for that matter. So on the left, we have a woman sort of shoehorned into a storefront. On the right, a woman demonstrating at Zion National Park in a loom that was clearly constructed for this purpose of demonstration. In Monument Valley, where Happy Kla lived, many photo sites that are staged scenes for tourists to see weaving, photographers to record weaving as well. And you'll see these scenes over and over and over again. The processes are my favorite aspect of the postcard depictions. It's quite remarkable, the range of things that they show. Here you see a Navajo sheep dipping. There is a deep trough just beyond one of those corrals, and people are pushing the sheep through a poisonous bath to cut down on lice and other vermin on their fleeces. And this was going on in the 1970s when I was still, when I first started working around Navajo country. I'm not sure now how much this happens. This is one of those passing practices that is commemorated in the photographs. Burton Fraser was a photographer not sponsored by Fred Harvey, who produced over 60,000 negatives in his time in not just the Southwest. He was from Pasadena, and he photographed all up and down the California coast as well as in the Southwest. He produced little packets of photographs so that you could add 8 genuine photos to your albums, which is a marvelous thing. He had a 40-year career. He documented tremendously the blow-by-blow making of Navajo rugs, from the sheep herding and the sheep dipping you just saw, to the shearing of sheep with hand shears, which is still done, to the carding of the wool and the spinning of the wool and the dyeing of the wool, and then finally the weaving itself. Now, Mr. Fraser produced these black and white photos. He also had hand-colored, hand-tinted images reproduced. He played a bit free and loose, as you're going to see in a few minutes. But meanwhile, he did us some huge service. In photographing these herds of sheep, this is 1932, 1933, and any of you know your Southwestern history know that in 1934, the US government mandated livestock reduction in Navajo country, and the flocks were decimated cruelly in front of their owners, and then not made available in terms of their product, in fact. So this shows us the sheep herds before that reduction took place. And in blowing it up, I can count the numbers of black sheep against the white sheep. I can see the little goats as well as sheep. I haven't used my magnifier to look for four-horned sheep, but I bet we'd find some in some of Burton Fraser's photographs. So I'm indebted to him for recording this before the livestock reduction actually occurred. We have stereographs as well, and wonderful photographs that show us the absolute detail in the loom construction, where you're now used to seeing the upright poles, the cross poles, the ropes here that tension the loom, and then all of the heddle sticks, shed sticks that control the weaving as she's holding a comb and a batten to make her rug in this case. This is one of my photographs from 1990 or 91. It is one woman's solution to how do you make a big rug. Asan Yellowhair was a master at this, and she wove almost only big rugs in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. It is not, however, the only way, and it's not the way I'm aware of for contemporary weavers, but what we wanted to do was look back in history to see how other weavers accommodated large pieces. And here you see a woman named Hostine Nez Assan and her children. Now, I was delighted that the photographer recorded the weaver's name. The weaver's name means Mr. Tall Man, his wife, which is a way that many Navajo people refer to themselves and to each other, by relationships. But it tells us very little, in fact, in this case. So here, she has the uprights that you just saw, and the cross beam holding the tension ropes, and this is where she's weaving up to finish her rug right here. She is almost done, but her rug wraps around a beam, up and over a beam, back down again, and finally up again to be lashed to this loom. So this is a wonderful example of how a weaver would accommodate a large rug. It leaves certain traits in the rug itself, and so in museum collections we see those traits, but we wanted to see the loom, and here we have it. There are other traits that we can see as well. In this fun example, a weaver has actually started here in front of herself and woven up, and then she took this entire web out of her loom and turned it 180 degrees, and now she's starting to weave here up to meet it in the middle. And again, this kind of practice leaves certain traits in the actual final web that have lasted for over a century in many pieces in museum collections. And here we have a great photograph of how that looks when it's done. This weaver is accommodating a very wide piece by making a diagonal line here. She wove over here first, wove up to that point. Now she's moved over and she's going to be weaving up on top of this diagonal line, which is called a lazy line in the trade. It's not a Navajo name. And in doing so, she leaves a very subtle diagonal in the fabric that we will see forevermore. So these were wonderful illustrations, but you know, as much I delight in seeing rodeo pictures in the background and men's ties hanging from the loom, and just the stuff of everyday life in addition. Here a weaver is working on a pictorial figure. These are his moccasins and kilt and torso, and she'll be coming up, but then look what happens. She's angled this piece in a very interesting way. And weavers who've looked at this piece with me, you're just delighted to see the creativity of that kind of loom. So, and here, again, an alternate model of a loom with side supports, but two webs suspended on the same series of bars. And the little girl is weaving a straightforward rug design, and her mother or grandmother is weaving a very elaborate twill saddle blanket. And these are the kind of pictures that I just delight in blowing up on the screen and bringing weavers in to examine more closely. So back to Burton Fraser. We had to choose a cover for this book. And my original choice was the lower right-hand photograph because it showed the hogan, the loom, the kids, the sheep, the rocks. I liked it a lot. Ramona Sakiestua, my partner in crime, said, there's something fishy about that photograph. Don't take it. And so we chose Elle of Ganado weaving that wonderful red rug on the cover. And we chose the black and white version of that for the back. And we had to do that months before we'd written the text and really examined a lot of the photographs. And then inside, we chose as the frontispiece the color image, right? And I'd written all the labels for these and thought it was all done. And I was looking at these two photographs one day and I thought, well, okay, black and white photo and then a colorized version, right? And then I looked at that photo and I thought, I've seen that loom with its irregular posts, right? And I've seen those kids. And by golly, I've seen that cut out hogan, but that's the real horizon line at Ganado. And this ain't. And these guys may be in a corral somewhere, but they wandered off awful fast. So that gave us some pause, and I started rewriting labels, and I thought, okay. And then I looked at the rug on the loom. This is actually, I have another photo from the other side, and you can see it's a very clean, easy, smooth, geometric design. And I had already written a label for this photograph, which said, this is a young woman, this is an older woman, this is a winter hogan, this is a summer hogan. This kind of loom can be deconstructed and transported to somewhere else and added onto another loom structure. Easy. I'd written the whole label. I'd explained it all away. I came back and I thought, oh no. Wily Burton Fraser cut the photograph and pasted it in here. And so now you see the rest of the story. So there were all kinds of wonderful lessons learned in this process. Peter Hiller, who collected these photographs, collected curios and he collected up to the minute images as well. So this is a 1989 postcard with Jeremy Milord's artwork. And to close, speaking of artwork, in the book there are 7 chapters, and we open each chapter with an original artwork rather than a postcard. Peter had 5 prints and paintings, and I added these 2 to the mix. And I'm closing with a picture of these because someone asked me, what are you going to do after this book is done? My next book is going to be an examination of the artwork of Mac Schweitzer, the artist. Mac was a Tucson artist, Mary Alice Cox Schweitzer. She died in 1961, and she left behind an astounding body of work that's little known and that documents Navajo and Hopi Indian life in the 1940s and 1950s. So that's what's on my plate next. So thanks very much. I'm delighted to take questions, delighted to have a discussion with you. And he is prepared prepared to sell you books should you like them, but I do encourage you to visit your local libraries, share the books among yourself. It's not about sales, it's about sharing the stories and the images. Thanks. Questions? Yes?
How did they make their plans for the pattern, 100 years ago?
Good question. How did they make their plans for the pattern? 100 years ago or yesterday? It's the same way. Most weavers that I've talked with and that I know about say, the design comes from my mind. That's the most common phrase I hear. You saw the picture of the dual loom where the grandma was there and the little girl was there. I didn't comment, but there's a cradle board right next to that little girl, and that's a baby sitting against the loom. Navajo kids in traditional 20th century households were brought up with those images of rugs on the looms growing up as they grew up. It's true that almost all Navajo rugs as Navajo blankets in the 19th century were sold or traded, left the home. They were commercial from almost their beginnings. But the growth of that rug in the hogan for, it could be weeks, it could be months, allowed kids to grow up knowing those designs. So it's a matter of visualization as much as anything. Nowadays, people are looking at books, they're reading. When I was there in the 1970s and 80s, people were going into trading posts and taking Polaroids of rugs they liked and taking those home to weave from. Lots of inspiration. But it's still true that most weavers say, I sit down at the loom, I see the design in my mind's eye, and then I can weave it. I know of maybe a dozen weavers out of literally hundreds who draw their designs out or who mark on their warps in any way. By and large, it's a process that comes from the mind's eye.
How have dyes changed?
How have dyes changed over the 20th century? Well, let's talk 19th century as well. Do you know, it's a curious thing. In the 19th century, most of the blankets being woven were native sheep's wool and imported materials. In the 20th century, it's native sheep's wool and vegetal dyes, commercial dyes, and also imported materials. Nowadays, vegetal dyes are being revived again, but they are, as Hosanna knows well, much harder to produce, and fewer weavers are practicing with the vegetal dyes.
Can you explain what a vegetal dye is?
Sure, a vegetal dye is a plant dye, so it comes from plant sources. I know of a number of Navajo weavers in their lingo that call them vegetable dyes rather than vegetal dyes. But primarily they are the green and yellow parts of plants and the bark and the roots. And in most cases the dyes are made from, or the color is extracted from the plant by cooking or boiling it down. There are a few cases where the color is extracted by fermenting or simply long-term soaking as well. And if you're further interested in that, I would send you downtown to Wild West Weaving Gallery, and Hosanna can show you how it's done. I live close to her gallery, and I have a basement that gets used every couple weeks for dyeing in my yard. So if you come by my house, you'll see her yarns hanging on the fence. Good questions. Other sorts of questions? I know we've got a couple weavers in the crowd. We've got a couple historians. Well, thanks very much for being, Hosanna.
It's probably in the book, but how do they color the postcards?
How do they color the postcards themselves? I need to know more about that. I don't know. I queried Peter Hiller about that only very recently, and he wasn't sure either, so we have some research to do there. The question to me is how soon after postcards were produced in black and white form did the color additions happen? Because Burt and Fraser's are really very contemporary with each other, from what I can tell. But I don't know. Yeah. I somehow imagined that they hired artists to do that. But in what process, I don't know. Yeah. Betty?
Do you know when the color photography postcards came in?
When did the color photography postcards come in? I don't know. I know that most of them are marked Ektachrome or Kodachrome, and we associate them with the 50s and 60s in terms of dress and cars and everything else. But exactly when, I don't know, and I don't know if there was a precursor to those or not. It sort of bifurcates in the 20th century. You know, first half are those black and whites and the hand-tinted, last half were the Kodachrome, Ektachrome, brilliant colors. Again, a time when we had to be kind of careful about how we interpret the colors in those photos. Yeah.
I don't know if this is relevant, but I'm curious to know, sometimes you can, in the photograph, you can actually see through the warp, and it's light, you know. And so I wonder if you, I mean, I'm sure you could tell if it's thick yarn or thin yarn based on that.
Yeah. So viewing the looms, you can see the warps, and you can see the light through them, and so you can gauge the weight of the yarn that they're using for that. Yeah, yeah. And I love to give talks to a pure weaving group. I left out a lot of detail, a lot of photographs for a general audience, but looking at some of those carding and spinning photographs, for instance, a Navajo weaver will card the wool, and that produces, you know, something that might be 2 or 3 inches thick, a rolag from which she spins the yarn. But a Navajo weaver may spin that yarn and then respin it as many as 7 times before she's done creating her warp yarn. And these photos show that process. So if you look closely at the whole series, and I talk about this in the book, in one chapter there are specific technical discussions. And you can see that she has split down that rolag of thick to about a pencil thin thickness, and then she continues to spin from there. And I am saying she, and you have seen almost exclusively women weaving here. There are Navajo men who also weave, and we've known about men weaving since 1881, when one of the best of the tribe was a male Navajo weaver. Today there's a strong group of, a small but strong group of men weavers as well. It didn't happen in any of Peter's collection that men were represented, but we talk about them in the book because they should not be left out either.
And is the technology and the documentation in the 21st century radically different than it was in the 20th century and the 19th century?
Is the technology radically different in the 21st than the 20th or 19th?
And the documentation of, I mean, we got lucky with this. Are we
Yeah.
going to get lucky again?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting story to me. The technology is consistent throughout all 3 centuries, and before that, prior to that. You know, Navajo people are relative newcomers into the Southwest, having come from Athabascan roots in the north. And by the 14th, 15th centuries, Navajo and Apache people had settled in the Southwest and were very close neighbors and rivals with Puebloan people who had woven aboriginally and with trades that came up from Mexico and Peru. So we've got this collision of South America, Mesoamerica, Northern, and this amazing concentration of Navajo weaving that starts up in about 1650, 1700. We know by Spanish reports that Navajo weaving was well established by then. So the tools relate very closely to some of the South American, Mesoamerican tools, but even more closely to Pueblo Indian, specifically Hopi and Rio Grande Pueblo weaving tools. And those persist all the way to this day. There have been slight changes, and I mentioned several times the tensioning rope on the top of the loom. It's a zigzag rope, and it relates to the time when Spider-Man and Spider-Woman brought weaving to the Navajo people, to the Diné people. And that rope represents the lightning, the zigzag lightning, just as the warps represent sun rays, and every other element of that loom represents certain sacred mineralogical or meteorological objects. So that loom, given its spiritual origins and its symbolic representation, is something that people don't easily let go of. On the other hand, those zigzag ropes have become turnbuckles on many contemporary looms. And we had one photograph in this book that showed those turnbuckles. And it's the only photograph for which I was not given permission by the originator. We had Peter's permission to use everything, but some of these were copyrighted, and that one was copyrighted in a way I couldn't use it. So I talk about it in the caption, but can't show you the picture. So, one extension of your question, what is weaving like today? I love that there are contemporary weavers who are art trained. There are other contemporary weavers who've gone to art college, who've gone to art institutes, who are selling in galleries, who are curating their own museum shows. There's a very dynamic, vibrant art scene for contemporary young Navajo weavers, young even up into their 40s at this point, but particularly those in their 20s and 30s. I was just in New York City at Pace Gallery, a major Manhattan gallery, and I was there with two contemporary Navajo weavers who were just dynamite, and just doing amazing things. In Window Rock, there was a contemporary exhibition that showed an installation art by a young male Navajo weaver that is breaking new ground also. So they're moving in other directions now. But there are still what we call generational weavers, weavers who have woven like their moms and their grandmoms and their great-grandmoms. And it's a smaller number. There's no question. It's a diminishing number. But what they're doing and how they're doing it, and because of their interest in documenting it, I think there's still a future for Navajo weaving. It's not a dying art, as these postcards were trying to document at one point. Yeah. There's another question?
You answered one, but I have another. So the Navajos probably glean their weaving expertise from the Hopi and Pueblos?
She says the Navajos, from what I just said, probably gleaned their expertise from Hopi and other Pueblo Indians.
But they've taken center stage.
It's true. Yes. How to say it? I am telling you two parallel stories at the same time. I'm telling you of the origins from a Navajo perspective, a Diné perspective, in terms of Spider-Man and Spider-Woman, having brought weaving to, and they were holy people who brought the spiritual weaving to Navajo people. One of the fun things about that story and the narrative that's told and retold many times is that they didn't bring the designs. They brought the tools, the techniques, and the wherewithal to do this. The designs were always left up to an individual weaver. Pueblo weaving clearly predates Navajo entry into the Southwest. And yes, Navajo people arrived here and obviously intermarried, borrowed, stole, and incorporated Pueblo weaving into their work, but they made it their own as soon as they got their hands on it. There is such Navajo-ness to the patterns and designs and to the takeover of weaving, and the two traditions remain quite distinct. Did that kind of get at your answer? Yeah. Yes?
I'm just wondering if there's any historical record of the Navajos, probably from either Mesoamerican and or Pueblo weavers, weaving either agave maguey, which was a traditional Mesoamerican fiber woven, or Pima cotton or Mesoamerican cotton, because those were the two primary fibers woven pre-Columbian. And I'm just wondering if the real flourishing of the Navajo weaving came with the churros and the sheep and the Spanish.
Yeah, that's a nice, really sweeping question. Yeah, so we do have maguey and cotton in Mesoamerica pre-Columbian, and we see cotton, of course, moving into the Southwest. It was cultivated here and traded widely among the Pueblos. And we have very few, but we have some significant examples of Navajo cotton weaving. The Heard Museum owns a beautiful, great big sarape. Its white background is almost entirely hand-spun native cotton. It also has native sheep's wool, black and white, that I was referring to earlier. And as I'd said, in the 19th century, it also has commercial yarns. In this case, unraveled fabric, which are red. So that blanket represents the nexus of many things. And we date it somewhere around 1750, as I recall, by the other materials, or maybe 1750 to 1800. Very significant. We don't have any record or examples of maguey being woven, agave, maguey fiber, in Navajo weaving. In Aboriginal Pueblo weaving, in ancient Puebloan pre-Columbian textiles, we have native hemp, called Indian hemp. Apocynum is the Latin for it. We have a whole variety of other plant materials being used, but Navajo weaving did not adopt those. And I think you're right. Sheep came into the Southwest in 1598, early 1600s. Indigo dye came up from Mexico to dye dark blues, and all of those things converged at the same time that there was a flourishing of Navajo classic weaving. Yeah. All right, well, thank you for being here. Glad to talk separately afterwards.